Chapter 1. The Inn with a Special Sign. The pretty town of Golden Friars sits by a lake, surrounded by big purple mountains. The old graystone houses, church tower, and tall trees make it look magical, especially at night when the moonlight turns everything silver. One summer night, the moon shone brightly on the George and Dragon Inn, a cozy graystone place by the lake. The inn had a fancy sign showing St. George fighting a dragon, all colorful and shiny. Inside the inn, a few regulars relaxed in a comfy room with wooden walls. Dr. Torve, the town doctor, sat by the fire, enjoying some punch and chatting. Next to him was William Piers, a kind man who lived in India for many years. Old Jack Emerald, a retired Navy captain, drank his grog and talked loudly. Deaf Tom Holler sat calmly, smoking his pipe. The innkeeper sometimes joined them, sitting in his wooden chair and chatting with everyone. "And so Sir Bale is finally coming back home," said the doctor. "Did you hear anything else about it?" "Not much," replied Richard Turnbull, the innkeeper. "Nothing important, just that it's for the best. The old house won't look so sad anymore." "Does Twine say the estate owes a lot of money now?" whispered the doctor, winking. "Well, they say he's been spending quite a bit. I don't mind telling you, since we're all friends here. But he'll fix things eventually. He's more likely to save money here than where he is," nodded the doctor seriously. "He's making a smart choice," said Mr. Piers, puffing on his pipe. "It's commendable to make changes when needed. He's coming here to save money, and maybe even get married. It's even more commendable if he doesn't like the place and still chooses to come." And with that, Mr. Piers went back to smoking his pipe happily. "No, he doesn't like the place. At least that's what I've heard," added the innkeeper. "He despises it," nodded the doctor grimly. "And no wonder if the rumors I've heard are true," exclaimed old Jack Emerald. "Didn't he supposedly drown a woman and her child in the lake? Hey, hold on. Don't say that too loud. You're getting carried away." "Goodness gracious!" exclaimed the innkeeper after a tense silence, wide-eyed and with his pipe in hand. "I rent the house up there. I'm relieved. Thank goodness we're all alone here." Jack Emerald put his foot on the floor, leaving his wooden leg horizontal, and looked around a bit curious. "Well, if it wasn't him, it was someone else. I'm sure it happened up at Mardyke's. I took the measurements on the water myself from Gladscore to Mardyke's jetty, and from the George and Dragon sign down here to the White House under Forrick Fells. I could mark a spot over the exact location. Someone here told me the coordinates, I'd swear, where the body was seen, and yet no boat could ever reach it. And that was strange, you know, so I noted it in my log." "Aye, sir. There was some gossip like that, Captain," said Turnbull. "People like to talk, but it was his grandfather they talked about, not him. And it would be bad for business here if it seemed like there were such stories going around in the George and Dragon." "Well, his grandfather. It's all the same, I suppose. There was never any proof, Captain, just talk." And the family up at Mardyke's wouldn't let people talk about them like that, sir. Even though the ones who had the most reason to be upset about it are long gone, none of them would like to think people still believed it, and he would be just as upset as anyone. Not that I should worry more than anyone else, even though they say he's a bit rough and short-tempered. He can't kick me out of the George as long as I pay my rent for almost 1,000 years. And a man, even if he's really angry, has time to calm down before then. But it's no use arguing with stubborn people. He might be able to help or harm the George, and it's only fair to say it happened long before he was born, so there's no point in upsetting him. And I bet you £1, Captain, the doctor agrees with me. The doctor, whose business was also sensitive, nodded. And then he said, "But despite all that, the story is old, Dick Turnbull, older than you or I, my good friend. And best forgotten," added the innkeeper. "Aye, best forgotten. But it's unlikely to be," said the doctor, gathering courage. "Our friend the captain has heard it, and the mistake he made shows that there's something worse than people remembering it completely, and that is people half remembering it. We can't stop people talking, and a story like that will keep coming up and be on people's minds, still, just as strong as ever. And now that I think of it, it was Dick Harmon, an old sailor like myself, who has the boat down there, who told me that story. I was fishing for pike, and he took me over the spot, and that's how I heard it. I say, Tom, my friend, pour us another glass of brandy, will you?" shouted the captain's voice as the waiter crossed the room. And that red-faced and gray-haired naval hero put his leg back on the chair next to its wooden friend, which he liked to call his mast. "Well, I think people will talk about it for a long time," said the innkeeper. "And I don't mind the story as long as it's not about the wrong person." He tapped his glass with the spoon, signaling to Tom to refill it with punch. "And Sir Bale will probably be a friend to this inn. I don't see why not. The George and Dragon has been in our family since the time of King Charles II. It was William Turnbull back then, during what they call the Restoration, who got the lease from Sir Tony Mardyke's at the time. They were only knights then. They became baronets in the time of King George II. You can see it in the list of baronets and nobility. The lease was given to William Turnbull, who came from London, and he fixed up the stables, which were in bad shape, as you can still read in the lease today. And the inn has only had one sign since then, the George and Dragon, which is pretty well known in England, and one master's name. It has been owned by a Turnbull from then till now, and they haven't been seen as bad people." A murmur of agreement showed his guests agreed. They've been regular churchgoers, brewed good drinks, and had a good reputation here and elsewhere, though it's me, Richard Turnbull, saying it. And as long as they pay their rent, no one can kick them out, because their claim to the George and Dragon and the 2 fields and the plot of land and grazing their cows on the green is just as good as Sir Bale Mardyke's claim to the hall up there and the land. So it doesn't bother me, except in terms of being friendly, what the family might think of me. Only the George and they have always been kind and friendly, and I don't want to break that old tradition." "Well said, Dick," exclaimed Dr. Torvey. "I agree with you, but there isn't anyone here but us. And we're all friends, and you're in charge, and darn it, you'll tell us that story about the drowned woman, as you heard it from your father long ago. Yeah, do, and keep our drinks coming, my friend, shouted the captain. Mr. Piers looked hopeful, and deaf Mr. Holler, not particularly interested in the request, was at least a reliable witness, puffing on his pipe like a cozy piece of furniture. Richard Turnbull had his punch beside him. He glanced around. The door was shut, the fire was warm, and the punch smelled nice, with all friendly faces around him. So he said, "Gentlemen, since you all want to hear it, I don't see much harm in it. And anyway, it'll clear things up. It's been over 90 years. My father was just a boy back then, and many times I've heard him tell it right here in this room." And as he looked into his glass, he remembered, stirring his punch slowly. Chapter 2. The Story of the Drowned Woman. "It's not much of a story," said the innkeeper. "I won't keep you long, gentlemen. There was a pretty young lady, Miss Mary Feltram of Clusted. She was the last of her family and had become very poor. Now there's nothing left of the house but the walls. Grass grows in the hall and ivy covers the roof. No one has seen smoke from those chimneys in a long time. It's on the other side of the lake with a lot of old trees behind and beside it, near the gap in the valley under Maiden Fells. You can see it with a spyglass from the boathouse at Mardyke's Hall." "I've been there 50 times, said the doctor. "Well, there were dealings between the two families, and every family has both good and bad sides. But the Mardykes back then were a wild bunch. When old Feltram of Clusted died, his daughter, the young lady, was left under the care of Sir Jasper Mardykes. A bad day for her, poor girl. He was 20 years older than her, and not someone anyone could like or love, ugly and gloomy." "Gloomy," explained Dr. Torvay to the captain. "But they say they had an old bloodstone ring in the family with a charm in it. And somehow the poor girl fell in love with him. Some said they got married. Some said it was just a secret affair and never blessed by the priest. But either way, there was enough talk among the people, and she refused to leave. They had 2 children, and she begged him to acknowledge their marriage, poor thing. But it was no use, and he wouldn't let them have his name, only their mother's. He was a tough man and did as he pleased. And when he got tired of her, he decided to marry a lady from the Barnet family, and he needed to get rid of her and her children. So they were never seen at Mardyke's Hall again. The oldest child, a boy, was left in the care of my great-grandfather here at the George. That strange Philip Feltram who's been traveling with Sir Bale for so long. Is he a descendant of hers?" asked the doctor. "Her grandson," replied Mr. Piers, taking his pipe out for a moment, "and he's the last of that family line. Well, no one knew where she had gone. Some said far away, some said to the madhouse, some said different things. But neither she nor the child were ever seen or talked to by the people at Mardyke's again. There was a Mr. Wigram who lived in those times down at Maltree, and had served in the King's Navy like the captain here, and early one morning he came to town for a boat, saying he was looking towards Snake's Island through his spyglass, and he saw a woman about 150 yards away from it. The captain here heard the directions clearly. From her hips up, She was sticking straight out of the water with a baby in her arms. Well, no one else could see it, not even him when they got down to the boat. But the next morning, he saw the same thing again, and the boatmen saw it too, and they rowed towards it as fast as they could. But after a mile or so, they couldn't see it anymore and gave up. The next person who saw it was the vicar. I forget his name now, but he was on the lake for a funeral at Mortlock Church, and as he was sailing back, just passing Snake's Island, they suddenly heard a cry like a death scream, sharp and cold, that made their blood freeze. And looking along the water not far away, they saw the same eerie sight in the moonlight. So they turned the boat and came close enough to see her face. Pale it was, and soaked with water, and she was standing above the lake up to her waist, stiff as a board, holding the baby out to them, and smiling scornfully as they approached. They were half scared, not knowing what to make of it. But passing as close as they could, the vicar reached out to grab her, and she leaned forward, pushing the dead baby forward. And suddenly she let out a yell that terrified them, and they didn't see her anymore. It wasn't a living woman because she couldn't stand that high above the water, as they realized later, and they knew it was a ghost they saw, and you can be sure they prayed and blessed themselves and continued straight ahead with the wind, because neither of them would face such a frightening thing again even if they were offered all the Mardyke's riches. It was seen another time by people from the market crossing from Gillinstan in the same place, and Snake's Island got a bad reputation, and no one dared to go near it after dark. Do you know anything about that felt ram who has been with him abroad? Asked the doctor. They say he's not good at anything, a harmless fool. He was a tall, clumsy awkward when he left, said Richard Turnbull. The felt rams and the Mardykes were related, you know, and that made what happened to that young lady even harder. And this young man you're talking about is a grandson of the boy who was left here under my grandfather's care. Great-grandson. His father was the grandson, said Mr. Pearce. He had a position in the army and died in the West Indies. This Philip Feltram is the last of that family line. Illegitimate, you know, it is said, and what little remained of the Feltram property went to the Mardykes almost 80 years ago, and Sir Bale supports this Philip now. It's nice, despite all the stories one hears, gentlemen, that the only thing we know for sure about him is so kind. Indeed, agreed Mr. Turnbull. While they talked, the horn sounded, and the mail coach stopped at the door of the George and Dragon to drop off a passenger and his luggage. Dick Turnbull got up and went out to the hall with careful haste, and Dr. Torvey followed as far as the door, where he could see it, and saw several trunks covered in canvas thrown into the hall, and by careful Tom and a boy stacked one on top of the other behind the banister. It wouldn't have been right for him to go out and read the labels on them, or the doctor would have done so, so curious was he.